Welcome back to Uncle Grim, you cheeky bastards, where we get our little gray piles diminished, create our ass armies, and you guys get to either watch and listen to me read a chapter while I paint mine, or you can just put it on, putz around yours while creating your army, and listen to me read the chapters of the books. This one we're doing, as before, Leviathan. We're into chapter 2 now. I apologize for the gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2. I created the videos mostly for Instagram without thinking about the YouTube side. That way it just made a lengthier time gap between the two videos. But this point forward, I'll be doing one coherent video, chopping out for Instagram, putting it on there, and then making it for YouTube as a primary, and then doing the voiceover. With that being said, choose your faction: Imperium, Chaos, Xenos. We all know how it goes. But let's get into Chapter 2, Leviathan, written by Darius Hinks, published by the Black Library. Enjoy. Chapter 2, the fortress city at Xerac, Samnium Province, Regium. People swarmed into the library of Carnus, trailing mud over the mosaic floor and creating a murmured chorus. Hundreds of voices speaking quickly and quietly. Echoing up through the vast hexagonal atrium, there was a confusing jumble of gaudy outfits and accents, but people were united by one thing: fear. They huddled in groups, talking in urgent whispers and casting wary glances. The larger the gathering grew, the more frantic the conversation. Panic spread like a fever, growing with every whispered word. Governor Surrock was seated high above the throng on a balcony that jutted out between the uppermost tiers of seats. He was close enough to the dome ceiling to see the brushstrokes in the frieze, tiny echoes of humanity preserved in the Emperor's halo. He reached up into the air, letting his fingertips trace the shapes in the gold leaf, trying not to think about the weight of responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. He was surrounded by serfs, aides, and there was a huddle of priests sitting behind him, dressed in enough finery to shame the saints gliding overhead. He had never seen such an obscene display of wealth. Surrock guessed that just one of their trinkets would be worth enough to feed half of the population at his hive. The thought made his mood even darker. He turned to the senior priest. "Confessor Thurgo, you have been glaring at the proconsul since she arrived, and your anger has so far failed to conjure the divine intervention." Confessor's face was transformed by a charming smile. He laughed cheerfully, despite the grim mood that had filled the library. "Belazalf adopted your creed, despite being old enough to be your grandmother," continued Zurok. "Your faith is now her faith. Her temples are now your temples. Your work is done." Thurgo loosened his grip on the ornate scepter that he was holding, placing it in his lap, still smiling. "The Emperor's work is never done." Surrock studied the young priest. The man's features were delicate and sharp, his skin so pale it almost translucent. But his fragile appearance was deceptive. Since arriving on Regium, he had transformed the populace, suppressing centuries of beliefs and transforming the local priesthood without a single drop of blood. He followed the direction of the priest's gaze and studied the cause of his annoyance. "You'll never stop religious types mutilating themselves. At least not without undoing all your careful work." He looked down at the crowd. "Some knotted metal, some wood. And punctured skin. Does it matter?" "Governor Surrock, it does matter." Thurgo's voice was not quite smooth as usual. "They plant seeds under their skin. They think of God Emperor's blood as sap. These things are very relevant. Small deviations from doctrine led to large deviations. It's sacrilege and dangerous." Surrock decided to let the matter drop. This was not the time to be seen arguing with a senior Adeptus Ministronum prelate. He looked down at the crowd and saw Velazalth was looking back at him, whispering to a young woman whose kin was caged by the same tangled piercings that had so annoyed Thurgo. It was her protege and successor, the council called Damaris. The woman nodded to him and Thurgo, then continued making their way through the smoke. Velazalth muttered to herself as she barged through the crowd with her cane, making her way up to the side of the raised dais at the center of the room. "Why does everything require steps? Can't these people build anything flat?" Damaris was looking at the row of books that lined the walls, while the elderly magistrate, Urzin, watched her intently. Urzin was nearly as old as Vela, and she felt a wave of nausea every time she caught him looking at the younger woman. He was a craven-looking thing, with a tangled nest of white hair and sunken staring eyes.
"They put her songs in these," said Damaris, tapping a book.
Urzon nodded, his face contorted by an exaggerated expression of disapproval.
"Who do?"
replied Vela.
"The off-worlders. Their scribes print our songs in these books, and the same songs we're not allowed to sing. They steal the music from the mouths and pin it to a page." "They've turned us into an exhibit," whispered Urzon, squeezing Damaris's arm. Every part of Vela was hurting, her joints to her lungs. Even her scalp ached beneath her thinning hair. She usually found Damaris's passion endearing, but today she had no patience for it, and Urzon's lechery was grating on her. She replied with more force than she intended. "We're alive, and we're alive because of the off-worlders. What would have become of us if the Ultramarines hadn't been sent to Regium? We can't accept the loss of a few songs."
Damaris glared at Vela.
"Maybe you can forgive the off-worlders, the theft of our songs. But can you forgive them for what they did on this, our most holy site? Why didn't they build their fortress at Salamis Hive? That would have made more sense. But Confessor Thurgo insisted it was built here. Why did they have to tear down Arurus Nahor to build this ugly fortress? The largest shrine on the continent. Do you remember how she looked in the spring? Leaves glinting like fire. They bulldozed her without a thought."
Urzon squeezed Damaris's arm again.
"I can still hear roots weeping under all the stone."
Vela grunted in the annoyance. The off-worlders had taught them many disturbing truths, including the real nature of the trees they worshipped.
"There are no roots." "Not really. Not actual roots. There never were. We know that now, and we can hate it. But we can't unhear it."
Vela felt a flash of anger as she considered everything that had been taken away from them.
"We have to move on. We have to accept the new ways."
Damaris's eyes glittered with anger.
"The roots are there. We've seen them. Our dead are buried in them," whispered Urzon, staring at Damaris. "They were machines," snapped Vela. "All of them. The off-worlders showed us proof."
Urzon ignored her, continuing to look at Damaris with a sympathetic grimace. Vela jabbed someone's leg with a cane as they finally reached the top of the dais.
"This will do, and if I go any further, I'll have to kill someone."
She glanced at Damaris.
"We all know why Thurgo wanted the fortress built here. It was a statement of intent. We have to worship the God Emperor on their terms now, and that would never have happened while we were praying to Horus Nahor. We can argue over the doctrine, but their God Emperor is still the same God, Damaris. So we just have to adapt. Think of alternatives. Think what happens on worlds where people refuse to adapt. Where people cling to their old faith. People lose more than just songs. I can tell you that. We should count ourselves lucky. 1,000 years of tradition crushed under Rockcrete doesn't feel very lucky to me, and we survived well enough before they..."
Her words were interrupted as a crowd surged. There were mutters of annoyance as soldiers took their place on the far side of the dais, forcing everyone else to take a step back. The soldiers stared at the crowd, chins raised, standing at attention, armor and weapons clattering, their battle-worn green and drab uniforms made for sharp contrast to the finery on display around them. Over their battle fatigues they wore plates of scratched flak armor that were more appropriate for trench than gathering of nobles.
"These are the ones you should be cursing."
Vela nodded to two Cadian officers at the head of the squad.
"Look at their arrogance. They strut about like they're gods, but they're not. They're not like Lt.Castamon. They're not Adeptus Astartes. They're just normal people under that armor. But look how they lord over us. And she's the worst. The captain.
Tall, haughty-looking sergeant
she's the one who
with a
saved us from
ceremonial
heretics.
bugle at his belt. Urzon lowered his voice. Was a sinew-knotted
I heard.
When she finished giving commands to the sergeant, she looked out at the crowd, glaring defiantly. They all looked over at the captain. She was one of her eyes was dark and her second in command. The other was missing, replaced by a battered targeting scope.
Her face was a wasteland of scar tissue, so brutalized it was hard to guess her age, but she was certainly younger than the sergeant. "Hard to believe she did nothing," muttered Damaris as she met the captain's determined stare. Vela grunted, but found it hard to disagree. Captain Karpova noticed the consuls gawking at her, but chose to ignore them. Glancing around at the panic-looking crowd and then up at the tiered seating, she spotted the distant figure of Governor Surok on the balcony. He was a heavy-set bearded man who looked fiercely self-conscious. She saluted him and was pleased to see him nod in reply, and even more pleased when she realized who he was talking to. She knew Confessor Thurgo well. Having been deployed to Regium with him only a few months after Castamon, her conversations with Thurgo were one of the things that made her grateful she was on Regium. His unshakable faith was an inspiration, and it had renewed her own. "Sergeant Vellard," she said, addressing the officer at her side. "Status." She heard a crackle from the Vox link in his ear. He replied in his usual grandiose tones. "All squads are in position, Captain. I also ordered Sergeant Urich to position sentries at the main gates and to the fortress." She nodded, looking around at the crowd of nobles, tribal leaders, and priests. "The separatists would love this. Everyone who matters is cowering in this room, and no one's on guard. Doesn't matter how impressive the fortress is if you leave the damn gates open. Keep a close watch on the locals. When these crowds disperse, I'm going to find Lt.Castamon, but let me know if you see anything suspicious." Vollard glanced around at her. "Castamon?" "He's here. I saw him when we arrived. He's briefing Colonel Levizek and Major Lucanus right now, while I'm in the left in the dark. It's beyond a joke. We've kicked our heels on Regium for too long. Something has to be done." "With respect, Captain, Regium's the cornerstone of the entire Sanctus line. Whatever duty we're given here, I don't think we need to see this as kicking our heels." "We're sidelined. Mopping up the heretic cells is beneath us. This work could be done by planetary defense forces. Every day the war presses closer to Holy Terra, and we're stuck here, reprimanding criminals." Vollard gave her one of his grandiose smiles. "Captain, Regium's important, I get it. I'm not a damned fool. But the Sanctus line is no danger. Lt.Castamon has a large portion of the Ultramarines First Company under his command, and reserves the 8th and 9th. That's to say nothing of Regium Auxilia regiments he's got scattered across the continent. No planet outside the Sol system is this well defended. I have no idea who sent us here, but it was a slight. And now someone has engineered things so that here the Ultramarines are briefing everyone else. I bet it was Colonel Levitzik or Major Lucanus. Pompous desk-bound oafs. They should spend less time degenerating Cadian regiments and more time getting their hands dirty. We're wasted here. That's exactly what I'll tell the lieutenant." She pictured Lt.Castamon, and to her annoyance felt daunted by the prospect of approaching him. She had heard people describe Adeptus Astartes as beautiful, but she struggled to understand why. They were magnificent, of course, but there was something disturbing about those enlarged, almost human features. As soon as she heard she was to be deployed on Regium, she had researched Lt.Castamon. He was a decorated veteran, like the rest of the Ultramarines First Company, famed for his intellect and much of his savagery. Surely he would see sense. "If Castamon, the deep thinker everyone claims he is," she said, "he'll see we're too good for this, and the governor is hardly likely to argue with him." She nodded to a space in the crowd. "Come on, Surok will be starting soon, and I want to be close so I can corner him and find out where Lt.Castamon's briefing is." She gave Vollard a warning glance. "And don't get too comfortable. I can see the relaxing." Surok nodded to people as he made his way down towards the dais, adjusting braids on his uniform, trying and failing to make them lie flat. "Throne," he muttered. "So many people. Half the planet." Noticing the finery on display, he dusted himself off, raised his chin, striving to look at ease. He was overweight but muscular, just a pass for powerful rather than dissolute, an impression that was helped by the thick, cold, dark beard that reached down to his belt. He fussed at his collars, feeling stifled and uncomfortable in his starched dress coat. "They want answers," said his aide, a stocky, grim-faced woman called Lennox. She was dressed in a similar uniform to Sirach, looked quite equally unhappy about it. "No," Sirach glared at the politicians and grandees on the dais. "Not that way. Over here is fine. We'll be near the door. I want to leave the moment this is done. We have work to do, and I'm not getting trapped here." The two of them made their way through the throng, and Sirach kept his gaze fixed determinedly ahead, trying to avoid making eye contact. Officially, he was now superior to the highborn who was milling about him, but he still felt out of place. Most of these people had never worked a day in their life. They made flamboyant gestures with soft, elegant hands that made him conscious of how calloused and blocky his own fingers were. "Here," he snapped, gesturing for Lennox and the other aides to follow him into the space. "This'll do." Lennox stroked her lank, undercut hair, scowling, clearly infected by Sirach's discomfort. "We could have stayed in Salamis. We didn't need to leave the hive." She took out an Eho stick and offered it to him. "You didn't have to come in person." He waved the Eho stick away. "Look at these people. They're terrified. And I'll not have Salamis grind to a halt. I refuse to miss a single shipment. These princelings can bitch and whine all they like, but Salamis actually matters. They could lose a palace or two without noticing, but if we lose our manufactories, the whole Sanctus line suffers. Regium is the engine room of the whole damned show. How long would Sanctus line stand without fuel and ammunition? We've never missed the 10th quota, and I'll be damned if things are going to go wrong now that I'm in charge." A merchant in periwig managed to catch his eye and started to head over, but Sirach and Lennox glared at him until he veered off, pretending he was approaching someone else. Sirach dusted down his own jacket again. "How do I look?" He glanced awkwardly at Lennox. She picked mud from the frogging on his jacket. "Fine." He grunted, tugging at the cloth. "I look like an idiot." "You'll fit right in then." Sirach laughed despite the seriousness of the occasion. Then he recovered his composure and made his way onto the dais. Most people bowed, and a few even dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the floor as if in the presence of the emperor himself. He growled in annoyance and waved them to their feet. Confessor Thurgo and the other priests flanked him, droning prayers and swinging censers, and people shuffled backwards as he approached the center of the dais. He waited for the murmurs to die down, and allowed the quiet to ring out for a few moments. Then he pressed his fist across his chest and cried out, "For the Emperor!" Even unamplified, his voice boomed in the atrium. There was a brief silence. Then everyone in the crowd mirrored his pose and echoed his cry. "I know for many of you it has been hard to reach this fortress," he said. "Some of you crossed half the province to be here, and I know you're all concerned about what you have left behind. But once you've heard what I have to say, I hope you'll feel able to return home. I know you've all been afflicted by these dreadful nightmares." He realized he was tripping over his words, so he paused and steadied his nerves. "My lord," said a noble, seizing the chance to interrupt. He looked at Sirach with obvious disdain. "It is more than just nightmares. The whole of the Vanard Peninsula is cut off. We have no safe route to Salamis Hive anymore. We lost dozens of caravan. There's not rioting right across the province, and other roads are free from danger. Even getting here was almost impossible." As he spoke, the people nodded in agreement. The man's voice grew in confidence. We can't bring you any fuel, and there's trouble everywhere. Whole towns are burning. We can't get any clear news of what's going on. But there are terrible stories, bodies thrown on pyres, people dying in the hundreds." "Shelab City is the same," said a woman on the opposite side of the atrium. "No one can get to the hive, and there are fires burning day and night." She looked around. Does anyone even know what the attacks are for? What do these separatists expect us to do? What do they actually want? A chorus of panicked voices erupted as people shouted over each other, relaying tales of violence and disorder. Then Surrock raised his hand for silence. Some people were so frantic that it took them a moment to notice the gesture. But soon the library was quiet again. Surrock studied the crowd and wondered how he had ended up in this situation. When the Ultramarines had landed on Regium, one of the first acts was to execute the presiding governor and dissolve his entire chain of command. Surrock had not been overly surprised. Regium's rulers had been in thrall to criminals for decades. But he was surprised by what happened next. Lt.Castamon had informed him that the logisticars of the Adeptus Administratum had given him the job of governing Regium. At first he had been horrified, but over the following months he had begun to relish the opportunity. He had spent his entire life covering for self-interested frauds. He soon realized that he could hardly be worse than the leaders who came before, and perhaps he could even be better. He had even begun to think of ways to improve the Hive at Salamas, which made him all the more determined not to let the place slide into anarchy. He thought back to his conversations with Lt.Castamon and tried to speak with the same calm and gravitas the Ultramarine always showed. I know all about the problems you're facing. I'm facing exactly the same at Salamis Hive. But I'm here to assure you, I've spoken to Lt.Castamon violence the Ultramarines. It's a phenomenon he's encountered before, triggered by a small fleet of alien ships that's skidding the edge of our system. There was a chorus of shocked whispers, but he held up his hand for silence again. The Xenos are no threat to us here, but the Ultramarines have launched ships and will deal with the matter. The lieutenant assures me that once the Xenos ships have been destroyed, our problems will start to ease. Normality will return, but in the meantime, we have to remain calm and maintain order. All militarum regiments are being redeployed. The Ultramarines are briefing them now. They will restore order at all the large population centers, while I focus on maintaining the output from Salamis Hive. To ensure we make the Tith commitments, Captain Karpova and her entire regiment will be traveling north with me when I return to the Hive. Karpova stiffened, and Surrock saw outrage flash in her eye. So he continued, remembering the advice Castamon had given him. I have chosen Captain Karpova and her regiment above all others, after being advised to do so by Lt.Castamon. The anger in Karpova's eye was now mingled with curiosity. Castamon has followed her career closely and assured me she is one of the Imperium's most inspired soldiers. He cast his gaze around the room. He told me that Karpova was personally responsible for the success of the rearguard actions on Sinus 4, and that it was her skill as a tactician that broke the siege on Sestos Prime. He knew that a few of the people on Regium would have heard these military engagements, but his words hit the desired target. The anger faded from Karpova's eye, and she somehow managed to stand even more erect. Had her skin been less scarred, he imagined she might now be blushing. Surrock was impressed. Castamon had known exactly the right way to bring her on side. With Salaman's back under control, we will quickly restore the order in the rest of the province. He looked out at the crowd. Salamas has been mismanaged and neglected by my predecessors to such an extent that there is now a spiritual rot, which is why these seditionists and lunatics have been able to create so many problems. Captain Karpova and her regiment can deal with the symptoms, but I need someone to dig down to the root of the problem, which is why I shall also be taking Confessor Thurgo of the Adeptus Ministronum back to the Hive with me. He and his priests will ensure that the faithless are returned to the fold. Faith and military might will hold the province together, but you must all play your part. Lt.Castamon assures me this will be all over soon. He raised his voice. In the meantime, we must not allow sedition and hearsay to take root. He was pleased and not a little surprised to see that most of the people were nodding, accepting his explanation. But he could also see that many of them were raising their hands, bursting with questions. For a moment he considered staying where he was and doing his best to answer them. But then he realized there was a better option. "Confessor Thurgo," he said, turning to the priest, "I have other urgent matters to attend to, so this would be an opportune moment for you to explain your holy mission on Rhygium. There are many here who have not yet had the chance to hear you preach." Thurgo's eyes blazed. He smoothed down his robes and bowed. "It would be an honor." Alarmed voices called out, but Thurgo strode confidently across the dais and raised his hands, bathing in the panic as if it were applause. "Children of the throne, I bring you glorious news from the Emperor of Mankind." As Thurgo slipped seamlessly into his sermon, Sirach made his way down from the dais and headed towards the doors, scowling at anyone brave enough to try and address him. "You'll make a fine politician yet," said Lynette, as they hurried out of the library.